There is something quietly unsettling about feeling tense when you have every reason not to. You look around at your life, the bills are paid, the people you love are safe. Nothing is on fire, and yet somewhere beneath the surface, your body is still braced, still listening, still waiting for something to go wrong that hasn't gone wrong yet, and you've tried to fix it. You've tried the meditation apps and the screen-free mornings. You've breathed through it. You've gone on the vacation and come home feeling exactly the same way you left. Maybe you've even sat across from a therapist and described it as best you could. This low-level hum of readiness you can't quite name and can't quite put down. And yet here you are, still carrying it. Most people who feel this way assume one of two things. Either something is wrong with them, or this is simply who they are. A personality that runs a little hot. A mind that doesn't know how to switch off. But there is a third possibility, one that most conversations about anxiety and stress never quite reach, and it doesn't live in your personality. It lives in your nervous system. And more specifically, it lives in the history your nervous system has quietly been keeping on your behalf. You belong to a generation that doesn't get talked about very much. Born somewhere between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, you are what some researchers and cultural observers have started calling Xennials, too young to be fully Gen X, too old to be a true millennial, shaped by a very specific window of time that created a very specific kind of inner life. And if you've ever felt like the tension you carry doesn't match the life you're actually living, what follows might be the most useful framework you've ever encountered for understanding why your nervous system was built during a particular sequence of events. Not just any difficult events, a sequence. And the sequence matters in ways that almost nobody talks about. To understand why, you first need to understand something about how the human stress response is actually designed to work. Neuroscientist Dan Siegel introduced the concept of the window of tolerance, which describes the zone within which your nervous system can function without either flooding into overwhelming reactivity or collapsing into numbness and shutdown. Inside that window, you can think clearly, connect with other people, handle difficulty without falling apart. A well-regulated nervous system moves fluidly in that space. Something activates your threat response. Your body mobilizes. The threat passes, you recover. The system returns to baseline. That's the full cycle. That's what healthy stress looks like from the inside. But here's what most people don't realize: that window isn't fixed at birth. It gets built over time, through repeated experiences of activation, followed by genuine recovery. If recovery consistently doesn't happen, if the next wave arrives before the last one fully resolved, the window begins to narrow. And once it narrows enough, it tends to stay that way. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but it stays. Now think about the timeline your nervous system was actually given to work with. As a Xennial, your core developmental years, the years when your nervous system was most actively calibrating itself to the world, ran straight through one of the most psychologically turbulent sequences in modern American history. The Cold War ended while you were in elementary school, but the certainty that was supposed to come with peace never quite arrived. The 1990s carried a feeling of optimism. But you were also old enough to register the Gulf War unfolding on television screens. You were old enough to absorb the ambient unease of the adults around you, and young enough that you had no framework for naming what you were absorbing. Then September 11th happened. You were somewhere between your early teens and your mid-20s, smack in the middle of the developmental window when the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for regulating your fear response, was still being constructed. What that event wrote into your threat architecture wasn't only grief or shock. It was a deeper recalibration of what the word safe actually means. Before that morning, safety was a reasonable baseline assumption. After it, safety became something that required ongoing verification. 7 years later, the financial crisis of 2008 arrived. Most Xennials were in their late 20s and early 30s, the exact years you're supposed to be building something stable. A career, a home, a sense of footing. Instead, the ground shifted in ways that felt completely outside anyone's control. And then, just as you were entering your late 30s and early 40s, the pandemic arrived and rearranged everything again. What you just heard wasn't a list of difficult historical moments. It was a neurological sequence. And the difference between those two descriptions is everything. There is a widespread assumption in our culture that repeated stress builds resilience, that what doesn't break you makes you stronger. And for certain kinds of stress, controllable, predictable, moderate, with genuine recovery between episodes, that's actually true. It's a process called stress inoculation, and it genuinely strengthens the stress response system over time. But the Xennial timeline doesn't describe that kind of stress. It describes the opposite: sudden, uncontrollable, sequential, with no real recovery window between each wave. And that kind of stress doesn't toughen the nervous system. It lowers the threshold. This phenomenon has a name in the neuroscience literature. It's called stress sensitization, and the underlying mechanism, first documented by psychiatrist Robert Pose at the National Institute of Mental Health, is known as the kindling effect. Originally observed in seizure research, the kindling model demonstrated that repeated stimulation can permanently shift the brain's firing threshold, not because the brain got weaker, but because the threshold itself moved. Post and later researchers, including neuroscientist Charles Nemours, identified the same pattern playing out in the human stress response system. Repeated, uncontrollable stress gradually lowers the threshold required to trigger a full threat response, which means that, after enough of these experiences, you don't need a major crisis to feel destabilized. A tense email, a change in someone's tone, an unexpected shift in plans, any of these can send your system into a state of high alert that feels completely out of proportion to what just happened. That's not overreaction. That's not weakness or sensitivity or a character flaw. That is a lowered threshold built by a very specific sequence of events. And there is a profound difference between those two things. One is something wrong with you. The other is something your nervous system learned in response to an environment that genuinely was, for a long time, unpredictable. There's another layer to this that goes even deeper. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges, the researcher behind polyvagal theory, introduced a concept he called neuroception, your nervous system's continuous, unconscious scan for cues of safety or threat. This scan runs constantly in the background, below the level of conscious awareness, before you've formed a single coherent thought. In a nervous system that has been sensitized over years, that scan is running on an outdated model. It reads ambiguous signals, a pause in a conversation, an unanswered message, a room that feels slightly too loud, not as neutral, but as potentially dangerous. And here's the part that makes this so disorienting. You know, rationally, that you're fine. You can list all the reasons. You can think through it logically. But neuroception doesn't process logic. It processes pattern. And the pattern it learned, across years of genuine unpredictability, was this: things that feel fine have a way of not staying fine. And then there's one more layer that almost every conversation about this skips entirely. Research by neuroscientist Bud Craig and cognitive neuroscientist Sarah Garfinkel at the University of Sussex has mapped what happens to interoception, the brain's capacity to sense and interpret its own internal physical signals under conditions of chronic stress. It gets blunted. You stop hearing the early signals, the chest that tightened an hour ago, the breath that went shallow during that phone call, the jaw that's been clenched since this morning. You're not consciously ignoring those things. You genuinely can't hear them anymore. That internal early warning system turned down so gradually that you didn't notice when it stopped working reliably, which means that by the time something registers as wrong, it has often been building for a long time. Your body was sending signals the whole time. The line just got too noisy to hear. This is why logic alone isn't enough to regulate a sensitized nervous system. Not because you're not trying, and not because you lack self, but because the stress response doesn't originate in the thinking brain. It originates in the limbic system, the amygdala, the brainstem structures that exist below language, below reasoning, below the part of you that reads and understands and reflects. Somatic therapist Peter Levine, the researcher behind somatic experiencing, documented what he called incomplete stress responses. When the body prepares to respond to a threat and isn't able to fully complete that response because the threat is chronic, or ongoing, or never fully resolves, the tension doesn't dissolve on its own. It stays. It becomes the background hum that you eventually start to confuse with your personality. You can understand everything described in this video, and still feel exactly the same in your body afterward. That's not failure. That is neurobiology. And knowing that it is neurobiology changes something important. It tells you what kind of work might actually reach it. Recovery from a sensitized nervous system doesn't look like going back to who you were before. The threshold doesn't reset simply because you decide it should, but it can shift slowly, gradually, through the body, rather than through the thinking mind alone. Through completing the stress responses that were never allowed to finish, through repeated experiences of activation followed by genuine rest, through environments that are safe enough and consistent enough for the nervous system to begin slowly revising its threat model. This work doesn't fit a productivity framework. It isn't quick, and it doesn't require you to have been broken to pursue it. What you're actually working with isn't a damaged nervous system. It's a calibrated one, calibrated to a world that was, for a very specific sequence of years, genuinely unpredictable. And recalibration takes longer than the original calibration did. That's not a flaw in you. That's just how the system was designed. Systems that learn to survive in uncertainty don't release that learning lightly. They need to be shown, repeatedly, that the new information is real, that the ground is actually stable, that this time, recovery is actually allowed. So if you have spent years trying to feel better, trying to think your way back to baseline, trying to fix with logic what isn't a logical problem, and you keep landing in the same place, now you have a more precise lens for what you're actually carrying. Not anxiety as a personality trait, not a mind that simply doesn't know how to rest. A sensitized nervous system with a narrowed window and a lowered threshold, built during a sequence of events that arrived before the system was finished forming. That is a different frame, and a different frame opens up a different kind of work. If this resonated with you, there is more waiting for you at Every week, we go deeper into the psychology behind the patterns that quietly shape your inner life. The ones that feel personal but are actually deeply human. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because understanding yourself at this level isn't just interesting, it's the beginning of actually changing.